Thank you for coming to Belmont Books' virtual event tonight. I always like to thank everyone for attending a virtual event after spending probably most of your days on the computer in Zoom meetings. I'm sure you're
Yeah.
all screened out, so we really appreciate you spending your social time and your free time in the evenings with us back on your computer. Um, for those of you who are joining all around the world, Belmont
Yeah.
Books is an independent bookstore located in the greater Boston area. And if you wanted to purchase either of these lovely writers' books tonight, we do ship around the US, so that is an option. Um, we also have one more event this week tomorrow. It is father and daughter poetry duo Maxim D. Schreier and Tatiana Schreier. They're going to have a very interesting night. They're going to be in the same room together talking about their poetry. So I think it's going to be a very lovely night of poetry and of togetherness. And I think it's the first time I've seen an event where both of the authors are in the same room, which is wild these days. um, but let's get started into our event. We'll start by introducing David Livingstone Smith, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Biddeford, Maine, whose work has been translated into 7 languages. He's been featured in several primetime television documentaries and was a guest at the 2012 G20 Economic Summit, where he spoke about dehumanization and mass violence, which makes him a wonderful speaking partner for Serena Parekh. And she's an associate professor of philosophy at Northeastern University in Boston. She directs the politics, philosophy, and economics program there. She's also published numerous articles on social and political philosophy. She also has several, I think 2 or 3 now books under her belt on this exact topic. So I'm sure she has a lot to say. I'm going to turn it over to these two in about 45 minutes. We'll just start a Q&A. You can submit your questions into the Q&A portion along the bottom of your screen. It looks like 2 speech bubbles. But if you type something in the chat, I'm sure we'll catch it as well, since this is a pretty intimate group tonight. So David and Serena, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to do this. I heard Serena speak some years ago. I have no memory for dates, so I have no idea how long ago it was, on this very topic. And I was blown away. It was so important and so educational. So I devoured the book, which I would encourage you all straight away to get. It's incredibly informative on many different levels, as I'm sure will come out this evening. And I want to encourage all of you to purchase it from Belmont Books. Support independent bookstores. I know it's easy to push a button and get things from Amazon, but they don't need your money. Independent bookstores do need your money. So, like I said, I think this is a really important book on a couple of levels. It's a philosophical text, but it's not the kind of philosophy that I like to call high-class Sudoku, playing word games. It's philosophy that addresses real, urgent, important topics. And the book has 2 sides to it. Simply as a book on the plight of refugees, it is just immensely informative. And one of the things I recognize reading this is how little I understood about the circumstances of refugees. And I assume that that's true of most people. So you could purchase the book. It's worth the money just for that, to learn the facts and figures, the laws, the definitions, and so on. But in addition to that, the book takes up well, as the subtitle says, the ethics and the global refugee crisis, the ethical, philosophical dimension of what our obligations are to people in these circumstances. Now, by way of kicking off, I was initially going to read one of the many stories that Serena Parekh includes in this book. But this morning, when I woke up and rubbed my eyes and went on the news, I found a story unfolding today, which makes things rather immediate. So I would like to take the liberty of reading that to you. This is from, what is it from? Is it CNN? I'm not sure. And then we'll get on to Serena talking about her work. Bexar County, Texas. State and federal authorities are searching for a tractor trailer in Texas that may be smuggling about 80 undocumented immigrants. Some of them may be already dead. It's a desperate search for alleged victims of a human trafficking operation, trapped in the back of a tanker truck. The 9/11 call is difficult to listen to. One of several from someone alleging to be in the tanker with other immigrants. The caller said they were out of oxygen. The comments are translated from Spanish. Operator, do you see anything? Caller, no, we can't see anything. God, we don't have oxygen. Dispatcher, you're next to the highway? Caller, yes, I hear cars. Caller, a tanker, a white tanker. Dispatcher, white? Caller, yes, we are like 80 people. Dispatcher, do you remember who was driving? Just think about this for a minute beyond the words. Imagine being in these circumstances. Caller, no, we don't know who. Help. Dispatcher, do you have another cell phone? Caller, help. Holy be God, help. Operator, where did you start the trip? And then says, I lost him. The calls were made to both the San Antonio Police Department and the Bexar County Sheriff's Office. Quote, and so it's heartbreaking to hear, because clearly behind the caller in the background, you can hear others in the car, in the trailer, and they're also screaming for help in Spanish and saying that they're out of air, Bexar County Sheriff Javier Salazar said. In video recorded by a surveillance camera on I-35 near Fisher Road around midnight, you see the tanker and a black pickup pull up and then leave. They do that twice. The caller, at one point, says that some people are already dead. This is why the Sheriff's Office, Homeland Security investigators, the State Department of Public Safety, and San Antonio Police Department are asking anyone with information to come forward. Quote, I bet a lot of money that if the smugglers do encounter somebody in the back of that trailer that is very, very ill as a result of the conditions they were exposed to, or even dead, they're not going to do the right thing, Salazar said. They're going to dump a body, or they're going to abandon somebody at a hospital maybe. They're certainly not going to do the right thing. And so we're letting our deputies know to be on the lookout for anything. The only, end of quote, the only thing that is certain right now is that the tanker was traveling to San Antonio, and the signal from the caller was picked up around this area where the surveillance video is from. And that's the story of many people. So, Serena, if we can start right at the beginning of the book, you refer to the two refugee crises. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit and perhaps connect the latter with the story I just read.
Yeah, thanks so much for your kind words, David. They really mean a lot coming from a scholar of your caliber. Yeah, what an unbelievably heartbreaking story that is. And it sounded so familiar to me from other things that I've read, including the structure, the tankers, and the crisis in 2015 that erupted in Europe. There were a couple of particularly graphic deaths that caught people's imaginations. One was the young boy, Alan Kurdi, who washed up on shore. But the other was a tanker, a truck trailer tanker that had dozens of bodies found in it in Austria. So it's a similar situation, people who are being trafficked in these extremely dire circumstances, and things go bad and they're just left to die and nobody is held responsible for it. So starting from that, like, who's responsible for those people in the back of that truck who have suffocated? I think we want immediately to think it's the smugglers. How could they have done that? They are monsters. And that may very well be the case. I don't mean, what I'm about to say, I don't mean to defend them, but why did people choose, let me back up a second. They could be being trafficked against their will, but they are also very likely to have engaged with smugglers willingly in order to bring them over the border of Mexico into the United States, just like the case in Austria, where people who had willingly contract with smugglers to get them through Europe, probably to Germany or to Sweden. So the question is, why would somebody do that? Why would somebody put themselves in the back of the truck, packed in like sardines for who knows how long? Why would somebody put themselves on a raft to go across the Mediterranean with little food, water, no sense of how long the journey is going to take? Why would you put your kids through that? And that's where I think the story of how we should understand the global refugee crisis begins. We tend to see people when they arrive and think, what are they doing here? There's so many people. How are we going to handle them? We can't be responsible for taking everyone in. And that's what I describe as the first crisis, the crisis for those of us in Western countries who, live in relative affluence with relative security. And all of a sudden we see large numbers of people, or they seem like large numbers of people, and they seem like threats to us, either security threats, perhaps economic threats, and certainly political threats that we now have to decide, okay, what are we going to do? And this is, of course, playing out in the Biden administration as they try to figure out what exactly they're going to do with the asylum policy that Trump left behind, how rapidly they're going to resettle refugees and so forth. What does it mean for us? But I think it's really important to note that that's just one part of the global refugee crisis. And the other part, and I think in some ways the bigger part, is the crisis for refugees themselves. The people for whom being in the back of that truck was a better option than what they were leaving. As hard as that is to wrap your head around, there's an Eritrean proverb that says, a dead goat doesn't fear a butcher's knife. And if you keep that in mind when you think about asylum seekers, the choices that they make more sense. So then let me back up and say, well, why do you have to do that to get asylum? And asylum is the process where you flee your home country and you go to another country and ask for help. You ask to be admitted as a refugee. But in order to do that, you have to be physically present in the country you hope will give you asylum. And states know that. So what they do to limit their obligations to helping people is to put in place all kinds of obstacles to make it as difficult, frankly, as deadly as possible. And to such an extent that the only way you can get into countries like the US, Italy, Greece, Australia, is using smugglers. So again, these aren't traffickers. These aren't people who are forcing people, but these are people who you freely contract with. And many refugees and asylum seekers think of them as saviors because they're the only ones who are willing and able to help them. And of course, it occurs on such a wide scale now that the smugglers themselves are, among the worst kinds of organized gangs. So they were trafficking drugs, they were trafficking weapons. They saw this need to traffic people, and they're trafficking people. So going back to what I said earlier, we want to blame the smugglers, but they're a symptom of this larger story that's going on, though they themselves can also be absolutely horrific. It's funny that you read that story from today. This evening, as I was making dinner, there was a story on NPR about an asylum seeker from Eritrea who's now living in a refugee camp in Rwanda. And it recounted her absolutely horrific story, fleeing Eritrea with her father, holding his hand as he died in the desert. They walked for 10 days and he had no food, no water, he was diabetic. and he died in the desert. And then these smugglers like, all right, we've got somebody we can traffic. So they traffic her through Libya, where she's sexually assaulted numerous times. She gets in a boat to try to get to Malta. Anyway, she's pushed back to Libya against international law. And, now she's waiting in a refugee camp. So on the one hand, we see asylum seekers who come to the West, the US, Canada, and so forth. But the vast majority of refugees remain in the global South, in countries close to conflict.
Gosh, yes, that was a real eye-opener for me, and how persistently dangerous their circumstances can be. I mean, you spoke about Eritrea in particular in the book, and how finding refuge on the continent of Africa may still be very dangerous for this person. So maybe the next thing to get onto, you've already raised so many topics of importance, is the question of, well, what is a refugee? Does that term have some kind of definite meaning, so we can say these people are refugees and these people are something else?
You would think that it would, given how much is at stake in being a refugee. And if a country recognizes you as a refugee, it's like winning a lottery ticket. You get legal status, you get a work permit. Many countries will offer a whole host of benefits to help you integrate into society. There's a lot of sympathy for you. If you are considered an illegal migrant, then there's nothing. There's not even human sympathy for your plight. So there's a lot at stake. So you would think, well, obviously there's a clear definition, a clear way to define people. But of course, that's not the case. And what I try to articulate in my book is that what it comes down to is power. And there's so much at stake, and it's a term that's used in so many arbitrary ways, that it's important to be really careful and really humble about not only who we say are refugees, but who we exclude from this term as being a refugee. So I have a long discussion about, so there is an official legal definition that comes from the Refugee Convention of 1951, which defines a refugee as somebody who is forced to flee their home country, crosses a border, and they cannot or will not avail themselves of help from their country because of race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. So that's the official legal definition. But almost nobody uses that definition.
Right.
So it excludes, of course, people fleeing war, quite intentionally. It includes anyone fleeing economic circumstances. So it's used to distinguish economic migrants, people who might change countries in order to improve their economic prospects. But it doesn't distinguish people who might be fleeing poverty, life and death kind of economic circumstances in order to go to another country. So when countries resettle refugees, they will sometimes use a very narrow definition of a refugee, but then they make it even more narrow. So the US, for example, actually, let me back up for a second. Right, there are 24 million refugees around the world, and we resettle, and the best of circumstances, the height of the modern refugee resettlement system, which begins in the 1980s, maybe 120,000. So we've never resettled more than 1% of refugees in any given year. So given the number of refugees and the very few places countries are willing to offer them, we make it even narrower. So the US says, not only do you have to be a refugee according to that definition, but you also have to be of special humanitarian concern. So you have to be somebody who cannot be helped in any way except through resettlement. Widows, orphans, victims of sexual violence, victims of forced abortion, these are all in a special category of humanitarian concern, and they're more likely to be resettled than just your run-of-the-mill human being who is fleeing persecution from their home countries. So when we use the term colloquially, I think we use it to mean somebody who's fearing persecution, but I think we also use it to mean those who are entitled to our sympathy, those we should be helping. And I want us to draw as broad of a circle as we can around that. It doesn't mean we have to include everybody. There are legitimate ways, I think, of excluding some groups. But I sometimes fear, especially among philosophers, there's a big debate in philosophy, like who's a refugee, who's not a refugee. And I worry that that debate has the implication that if I define refugee clearly enough and you don't fall into that category, then we've done our part and you're on your own and everything's
that's
morally salient.
It's philosophical disease, isn't it? Necessary and sufficient conditions. The world isn't like that.
Exactly. And so that drives me nuts when I read that in philosophy, I have to admit. I mean, it's an important topic, like how morally do you define a refugee?
Yeah.
But we exclude so many people who are in such similar circumstances as to make it.
You'd think after 2,500 years of trying to specify necessary and sufficient conditions for things, one would kind of take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
One of the themes that you emphasize early on in the book as well is the plight of people who in failed states, whose government simply cannot protect them from crime. Perhaps these people dying in the tanker truck that we heard were in those sorts of circumstances. Could you speak to that issue a little bit?
Sure. According to the legal definition that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the persecution has to be done by the government or somebody acting on behalf of the government. So it has to be, Assad is targeting you because you spoke out against him and therefore you fled the country in order to be a refugee. So it doesn't tend to include, in particular for our, in this moment in 2021, people fleeing gang violence. So they're not fleeing persecution by the government, but at the same time, the government is unwilling or unable to protect them from the persecution. And so they flee from one place to another within their home countries. The gangs catch up to them. Eventually, they have to flee into other countries, but these gangs are so powerful that they will find them wherever they are. And they're really not safe until they arrive in the US and can integrate and change their name, perhaps, and so forth. Connected to the last point we were talking about the arbitrary nature of the term being refugee, I tell a story in the book of two women who cross over from Honduras, so through Mexico, of course, and to the United States, but they're from Honduras originally. And they're fleeing identical circumstances. They're a mother and a daughter, and they're both HIV positive. And they claim that they experience persecution from both state actors and non-state actors because of their HIV status. And one border guard says to the mother, oh yeah, that's legitimate. You can come into the United States and have an asylum hearing. And a different border guard says to the daughter, no way. You're lying. I don't believe you. I don't believe it's persecution. If you are telling the truth, it doesn't amount to persecution. So you are not allowed in the US. And he sent her back to Mexico. So that really, I think, puts a fine point on how difficult it is to have a moral system of exclusion, where we're trying to exclude people on the basis of these somewhat arbitrary grounds.
So, something we can get back to a little bit later on is maybe what criteria should be used to make this such a morally serious call about people's lives. Right, let me start that sentence differently. These people that are probably dead now in the tanker truck and similar cases that you mentioned, they're in very extreme circumstances, and it's tempting to think, well, if they're not on some rickety boat crossing the Mediterranean or trapped suffocating in a truck, refugees are not in dire circumstances. But you really disabuse us of that assumption in the book. And you talk about the minimal conditions for human dignity and how pervasively lacking those are for people in these circumstances. So maybe you could educate our listeners.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So I think you're exactly right. I think most people think, well, we can take in some refugees, but no, we're not responsible for everyone. Like somebody, they're taken care of somewhere else. And we sort of have this vague sense that they're in a refugee camp, they're temporary. And what I argue in this idea of the second crisis for refugees is that once refugees flee the persecution in their home countries, they then have to navigate the harm that is done to them by the international community, who have given them three choices. So the first choice is hire a smuggler and get to the US or Australia on your own, risk your life, your health, your liberty to do that. The other two choices are stay where you are in the global south, either in refugee camps or informally in urban settlements and urban slums where they maybe live with family members or co-nationals. And the other important fact to keep in mind is that this is not for a matter of months. It's not even for a matter of years. The average length of time a human being is a refugee in the 21st century is 17 years, and 25 if you're fleeing war. As an average, some are much longer, some are shorter, but it's a long period of time. So in refugee camps, again, it's not just a temporary camp. There's some nice features about it. There's some stability, there's some security. But what refugees dislike the most is that there is no autonomy. You are not allowed to work. You're entirely dependent on handouts from the UN. You're not allowed to live where you want in the refugee camp. You're not allowed to come and go. Your potential is so curtailed as a human being. You just have to wait. And again, this might not be so bad for a few months or maybe even a few years. We were talking before this started about how antsy I'm feeling about the pandemic being over. And I'm in my home, I'm in my home country with all of the luxuries and comforts. Well, imagine just being cooped up for years on end, not knowing when it's going to end, not knowing what's going to happen to you. And at the same time having probably not enough food. The level of sexual violence in refugee camps is just appalling. So many people then choose not to live in refugee camps and they go to urban centers and live, without any help from the international community. Fewer than 1 in 10 people who live in urban centers have any help. And so they have much more freedom. They can come and go where they choose. They can work on the black market. They can save money. They can send money home. But it's precarious in the extreme. Housing is horrific. Labor exploitation is terrible. Because conditions are so bad, children often have to go to work in also terrible conditions in order to take care of their families so their families can survive. And for all the anxiety that we can connect with now about our children not being in school full time, not being in school properly with all of the normal supports in place, refugee children, especially in urban centers, will often not have any education for the duration of their childhood. And many refugees will report that as being the most intolerable part of being an urban refugee. And this is then what leads many people to the third choice, which is hiring a smuggler to try to seek asylum, because both of those two choices fail to provide the minimum conditions of human dignity for people while they're refugees. So they may go home eventually, they may be resettled, they may be integrated to where they're living, but while they're refugees, we have not figured out a way to allow people to live with dignity. And I think that's our fault. And that's our, in the largest sense of the term, as being members of powerful Western states who have effectively encouraged the use of refugee camps as the de facto way of responding to refugees. And then ignored the fact that half of the refugees globally refuse to go to refugee camps and want to live informally. And as I said, why would somebody choose to live in a refugee camp? It's the only way you can be resettled in a Western country. The refugees are increasingly aware that you have less than a 1% chance of being resettled, which, it's hard to hold on to hope when you know that those are the odds.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just so appalling. And there are so many misconceptions of the circumstances of refugees, and also some very toxic views of refugees as invaders, as parasites, and so on. I mean, it's that is just sheer tragedy. So now the question arises: what are the moral obligations? And it's really the second part of your book, right? Like, who is responsible? Who should be responsible? And what sort of obligations are there to assist these people?
I think of your work when I think of the way refugees are dehumanized in certain particular political moments in the US and Europe and Canada as well, and how easy it is to dehumanize them, how quickly they're led to be turned into the vilest criminals, sexual predators, etc. And the preface of the book, I try to go through each of these stereotypes, that they're criminals, that they're sexual predators, that they're economic drains, and show that there's just no evidence for this. And in fact, the opposite, like they're less likely to be sexual predators. They're less likely to be criminals. They're in fact a net gain for the economy. Refugees turn out to be a great economic investment, if that's what you're concerned about. And yet it's very, very deep how much people believe this. This book actually came out of my experience lecturing about refugees in 2016 in the last presidential cycle. And I remember talking to a group of students, so bright, well-meaning students who said, I've heard everything you said, but I'm still afraid of refugees. Because they had been so thoroughly demonized in the media. And if you say things over and over and over again, people just absorb it. Because we have no counter narrative, we have no counter to these sort of threatening images of refugees. So I'll just put a plug in for your work on that. So it's so important to understand that, to see it coming, and I really hope the Biden administration is prepared for this kind of backlash this time, in a way the Obama administration wasn't.
So why is it that we don't have a counter narrative? I mean, this is madness.
I think, refugees and refugee advocates are so busy just trying to help them, I think, that they don't, they're not thinking about this other side of the policy. Whereas it's really politically effective to demonize refugees, and very easy to do as well. But there's not as much to be gained on the other side, I think.
Right. So refugees become a political plaything, a tool. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a lot to be gained from demonizing them, and very little to be gained from saying they're not demons. They're actually great, and they contribute a lot. It doesn't have any political punch to it, if you will. So people tend to stay away from that.
So does it matter where the refugees are from with respect to their demonization? Is there a racial component to this?
There's absolutely a racial component to it. I'm trying to think of the last time we had sort of European-ish refugees in large numbers in the US, but it would have been a long time ago. So certainly we have the Central American refugees. 2016, for some reason, it was like Syrian refugees, which got wrapped up into this sort of idea of Muslims being scary and terrorists. And do we really want to let terrorists in? Chris Christie famously said that Syrian refugees are so dangerous, we shouldn't even let in toddlers and orphans, because, but your larger question of what do we owe refugees? How can we help refugees? To start at the smallest level, what we can do, like you and I and people who are in the audience right now, is to really reframe how we think about refugees, and to help people understand that they're not terrorists, sexual predators, criminals, etc. And that can be done through learning about refugees, through watching movies, to sharing ideas with people, and to really helping that counter narrative become prevalent. I was actually really heartened at the Muslim ban, at the number of people who showed up to support refugees. Many of them didn't know what refugees were. They just knew this rhetoric was wrong and bad. And So somehow that needs to be sustained. But in the larger picture, from a US perspective, we tend to think of helping refugees as resettling them in the US. And that's absolutely central and important. But I think that's just one piece of the larger picture, because as I said, we never resettle more than 1% of refugees globally. So what we have to think about is, how can we help refugees who will never be resettled, who will spend their lives, or spend decades of their lives as refugees living in the poorest countries in the world? And once we reframe our ethical obligations in that way, we'll see that there's a whole host of things we should be encouraging our governments to do, demanding that they do, to actually provide the minimum conditions of human dignity for refugees. A scholar once said that refugee camps have the rare folly of being both inhumane and expensive. So it's not the best way to help refugees it's not the best way for refugees. It's not the best way from an economic perspective. What we should be doing instead is thinking about ways that our aid to refugees and the countries that host them can actually increase their autonomy, by extension, their dignity. So for example, people have proposed public-private partnerships with the states that host refugees and companies that employ refugees, so that refugees would be allowed to work, earn money, etc., but also help the countries that they're staying in, so the countries themselves don't get resentful towards refugees. And at the same time, it becomes a global, sort of trade policy, which ultimately benefits everybody if we open our trade markets to companies that hire refugees. We can be thinking about so I think there's a really important role for refugees to play in answering this question: what help do they need and what is it that they want? And when you do ask refugees, they say surprising things, like what they want is electricity, because they want the internet, and something they want to be able to work. And women would like sanitary products, much like women prisoners in the US context. So all of these then provide, we certainly need to have ways of providing security. We need to have ways of allowing refugees to access food and clean water and housing. But all of those need to be done in ways that promote the dignity and the autonomy of refugees, and not just treat them as bodies to be tended to for years on end.
Yeah, so I think the way a lot of people look at refugees is, it's really unfortunate that these people are from these bad places that create these problems. And yeah, it's a good thing to help, but we don't really have any obligation to help. It's supererogatory, the way philosophers like to talk. It's a good thing, but it's not like we're doing wrong if we don't, or if we don't help to a significant extent. But you point out in the book, it's not that simple. And one of the, quite apart from issues around the nature of moral obligation, you also talk about the, if you break it, you buy it principle.
Sure, yeah. So philosophers, if those of you in the audience who aren't philosophers will pardon us for a minute, philosophers debate, the ground for moral obligations to help people. Particularly people who aren't fellow citizens. So we usually think we have obligations to help fellow citizens that are uncontroversial. But why should I help an Eritrean? I may not even know where Eritrea is on a map. And what would motivate a moral obligation to help people like this? So there are a lot of different ways that you could frame this. Maybe the most popular one is the idea of the principle of humanity. They are in such terrible circumstances, and we are able to help without sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth. I mean, it would be if we increased our aid to refugees by 1/4 per person each year, that would help tremendously, and we wouldn't even notice it. So our obligation can be based in something like that. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it in some circumstances, especially circumstances where we can see that our actions might have deliberately been linked to the outcome. So we invade Afghanistan. Now there are hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. So we certainly have some direct connection to them. But I worry too much that it makes it so overly simplifies the problem to make it seem that on the one hand, there are these bad countries that produce refugees, Eritrea, Sudan, Syria, and then there are these good countries, Canada, the US, Australia, that help. And the world, I think, is much more deeply interconnected than that. And I also try to argue that the help we've provided actually constitutes a new kind of harm that refugees themselves need to be rescued from. So refugee camps are not places for human beings to live for decades at a time. And then to say, well, if you don't want that, then you have to be totally on your own in an urban center without any help, without any education for your children, without any access to healthcare, clean water. That also is not an acceptable solution. So we've created the conditions such that refugees are actually need to navigate between the kinds of help that we give them. And this, I think, grounds an obligation to reform those structures. It just shouldn't be the case that the 20+ million people around the world who have no country to call a home should not have any access to human dignity. And I think this is such a pressing concern. I don't think it's a historical concern, but I think we need to answer this question for the 21st century when there's only going to be more refugees. Yeah. I think this is one area where your work and mine overlaps a lot. You could think of it as this historical thing, like I think people did in the past, but actually the future relevance of your work on dehumanization, and I think my work on refugees, like we really need to figure this out. We need to really figure out how we can help refugees.
And be prepared, yes. So, one of my concerns is climate change and the impact of climate change on displaced populations. And I think just in addition to the sheer suffering of displacement, the population of Bangladesh spills into India. I think it's a perfect storm for really terrible things, and unless we think ahead and take some sort of action, I can see tragedy, more tragedy than the tragedy that is amply existing in the present. So one of the themes in the book, and what you just said, is a theme of obligation. So on the assumption that most of our listeners are not philosophers, maybe to talk a little bit about, the bite of the notion of obligation as contrasted with, well, here's some things that are good to do, but they're not obligatory.
Yeah. So this is the question of justice. Justice demands something from us in a way that less forceful concepts don't. Like you said, there are many things that would be good to do. It would be nice to spend more time reading. It would be nice to donate more of your money to charity. But you're not doing something wrong by not doing it. But if I say, well, you have an obligation, say, to take care of your children. And if you decide, no, I'm not going to do that, like you've done something wrong. You haven't just, made an alternative choice or something like that. So I think you're right when you said earlier that most people think of helping refugees as just that, something you can do if you feel like it. If you're feeling generous, if, the economy's good, great, let's help refugees. But if not, we haven't done anything wrong. And the argument I try to make in the book is that in fact, we are doing something wrong. We are doing something wrong by supporting the current system of refugee protection that effectively harms refugees as they try to seek refuge. And this creates an obligation to rethink how we provide help globally. So I think reforming how we aid refugees in the global south, absolutely we need to do. And I think we need to think about resettlement. So for historical reasons, only a handful of countries resettle refugees. And I think one of the biggest things we can do, the Biden administration could do, is to play a role of moral leadership and to really point out to other countries that refugees are an obligation. We can't just ignore them and pretend we haven't done anything wrong. So we can work with other countries to make refugee resettlement part of foreign policy, part of discussions about trade policy and things like that in order to get more buy-in from countries.
What do you think the prospects are for this being taken seriously? I mean, there are all sorts of things that we can do, but I'm wondering what we will do.
Yeah, that's a great question. It feels like there are so many other pressing crises in the world, for sure. What will we do? You know, it depends on the day that you're asking me this. Sometimes I'm genuinely hopeful. So the Biden administration has made it clear that the worst of the Trump administration policies will not continue.
Yeah.
They've made it clear they're going to go back to the resettlement caps under the Obama administration, so about 125,000 from a low of 40,000 refugees per year. And that's not nothing, given how far the retrenchment away from refugees were. You know, so one part of the second crisis that I didn't mention, right? So we create these structures that don't really help refugees, in fact, hurt them. But we also have begun to harm refugees directly with no consequences. So philosophers talk about our positive duties and our negative duties. So, a negative duty is to refrain from harming, and a positive duty is to help people. Usually we think of helping refugees as positive duty. But generally speaking, we believe we have a strong obligation not to harm people.
Yeah.
But not these last 4 years, where it became policy to, in fact, inflict harm on refugees for the sake of domestic policy. So we want an immigration policy where people don't feel like they want to come to the United States. So we will separate children from their parents. We will inflict a kind of psychological torture on these people in order to send the message that we don't want asylum seekers in our country. And that is so far from the kinds of obligations that I'm talking about, that even to say that that is totally unacceptable, and in fact ought to be understood as a crime against humanity, right? The infliction of harm on a civilian for the sake of a domestic political aim. So how we think about that is no small feat as well. But so to some extent, I'm very optimistic that things will keep moving forward. But unless people demand that something deeper happens, it's unlikely that we will, take on the kind of moral leadership that I think we ought to be taking.
So it's kind of up to us.
It's up to us. Yeah,
it's up to us. I mean, we can make demands. We can exert whatever pressure is available to us to exert. It's no guarantee that anything will happen. But I think you've given such good reason to take this so seriously. So we have a question in the chat. So let me shoot that to you. Sabrina Smith says, it sounds like developed nations need to have systems in place to meet the needs of refugees. Is this something that they invest in, or do they address cases as they come?
It's a great question, Sabrina. Yes, we do need structures in place, and countries do it differently. So the US has sort of two sides to it. We have a really great system of refugee resettlement, where we have the systems in place to facilitate, to work with the UN in order to bring refugees from refugee camps around the world to the United States. Once they arrive in the United States, though, it's charities that then take over. So charities that have been doing this for years. Hayes, the Jewish refugee organization, works with refugees in order to resettle them, to find them an apartment. They get a small stipend from the government to start out for the first few months that they're here, but not very much. Canada has a very different system where they have a very robust integration program, language training, education, cultural training, etc. I might point out that there are different ways of doing it. And one of the ways that Canada has a two-pronged system of refugee resettlement, where you can come in through the government, just like the US does. They also have a system of private resettlement. So you have to be a group of, I think, 10 people. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can provide housing for 1 year and financially support a refugee family for 1 year. And then you effectively adopt a refugee family that you're responsible for a year. And about half the refugees in Canada come over through this private sponsorship program. But the effect it has on the Canadian psyche, I think, is really interesting. So for every refugee that comes in, there are about 10 people who are invested in them. And so that trickles out across the country. So you have this very positive sense of what role refugees play in your country, because so many more people get to know them and take responsibility for this process of integrating refugees. And it's really remarkable. So in 2016, you had this like night and day contrast. In the US, you had refugees are terrorists, we must keep them out, we must protect America. And in Canada, you had these Canadians who were sitting with empty apartments learning Arabic because they couldn't wait for their Syrian refugee family to arrive from the security screening so they could welcome them. And all these clothing drives to find winter clothing for Syrian children. And so it's a very different, and I think the programs, the systems that Serena mentioned, don't just respond to refugees, but structure how we're going to respond to refugees. I think that's really important.
Americans like to say we're a nation of immigrants, which is partially true. If you include some other ways that people have come here, for instance, in chains. Yeah. But just that aside, maybe a little bit of reframing might be helpful here. We're also a nation of refugees. My grandparents were refugees. There are many people who came here to escape persecution, to escape dire poverty, to escape nations that did not protect them from violence. And I wonder if we could build this more into our national identity, if it wouldn't contribute just a little bit to our to act against our tendency to other those who come here in need.
I have mixed feelings about that. So on the one hand, I totally agree. It used to be something we were so proud of. Like we're a country that takes in people in need. This is, we are the beacon on the hill. We are the country that helps when no one else helps. I feel like the problem with that, though, is what we think of are these, Marlene Dietrich and Hannah Arendt and Nabokov, and they're very Caucasian, they're very European.
Yeah.
And then when we have these refugee crises that involve people who look more like Osama bin Laden and less like Marlene Dietrich, all of a sudden that framing of them as a national treasure gets harder to see, to articulate. And, I'm part of these various refugee, networks. And so I'll often see things like a Syrian refugee doctor who will say like, this is my 5th, shift in the COVID ward. And, I'm so happy to be, in this country who's taking care of me, these amazingly touching stories, but somehow they don't seem to have that same kind of resonance with people. And so I also worry that holding up these models of refugees as these great heroic, highly accomplished people, many are absolutely, but many are just regular people who want to take care of their family and are actually nothing special. They're just like you and I. So I worry that overemphasizing their exceptional.
I didn't want to point to that so much as to reframe it's nowadays the word is immigrant, right, and that doesn't quite capture how many people came here, but a nation of refugees, it doesn't sound pretty, right?
And I think you point to something else that's really important, which is that the border of those two terms are shifting. So in the 19th century, how many people came to the US? They weren't officially refugees. Of course, we didn't have the Refugee Convention at the time, but they were fleeing really bad circumstances, dire poverty, persecution of religious persecution directly or indirectly, all kinds of other
famine,
that we would now consider them to be refugees in the, in our 21st century language. But they were immigrants, and so we are a nation of immigrants and not a nation of refugees.
That sounds much prettier.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions here. One is from John Kegg. To what extent does hope operate in either of your philosophical frameworks? I'm happy. You go first, and I'll tell you, and I'll respond.
Hi, John. Thanks for the question. It's great to have you here. Yeah. Hope is, I'm not quite sure what to say about it. I know that for myself, this is something I've thought a lot about, because I'm sure, like David, when you spend your days reading accounts of atrocities and suffering, it's sometimes hard to continue going and to write about it and to try to make meaning from it. And I know that if I didn't have a very deep well of hope, that something could be done. Something could be done better the next time we're faced with this challenge. I don't know that I could deal with it. Like, I would really feel a lot of despair, as I sometimes around climate change and around other things. So it's very motivating for me. And I try to end my book in a really hopeful note. Like, the very end of my book is people who go out of their way to help refugees in really surprising circumstances. A Sicilian fisherman who happens to find himself out at sea and sees a boat that's capsized. But Italy's just passed a law that says, if you help migrants, you're going to go to jail for 20 years. And he says, what am I going to do? Let them drown? And so he brings them back to Italy. He tends to them and risks 20 years in jail. And I have a bunch of accounts of people like this. So on the one hand, it's really easy to despair. But on the other hand, there are so many people working so hard to try to counter exactly the kind of cruelty that I describe in my book that keeps me hopeful.
Yeah.
David, do you have some thoughts about this?
I like to say that I'm hopeful but not optimistic. And by that I mean, I think there's a point in pushing on and trying to secure what one can secure. But that doesn't require any illusions about what one judges to be likely in the future. But of course, one's judgment can always be wrong. That's kind of a saving grace. Maybe things will work out a lot better. And even if they don't, it's worth trying to make them work out a lot better.
I was just reading Catherine Sickink's book called Evidence for Hope, where she makes the case that actually human rights are getting better and not worse, even though it seems like it. And one of the reasons it seems like things are getting worse is because we have this negativity bias, where things that are negative tend to leave a much more lasting impression on us than things that are positive. They tend to get filtered out more quickly. So I try to remind myself about that there is very good reason to hope. And there are a lot of good people out there working as hard as they can to make that happen.
Yeah, and of course that's true in many very important respects. Things are getting better. It's hard to. There's a funny calculus there, though, isn't there? Because our capacity to do more is also increased, and these things are always hostage to the vagaries of history. We can't make an induction that things will continue to improve. I mean, that's up to us, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is not a thing you do and then set it in motion and it's done. This is something you have to go back to constantly and affirm. The
arc of history tends towards justice if we keep pushing it and bending it, and we mustn't let go of it.
Exactly.
So we have a couple of more by the same person. I think we have time for these before we conclude. Kirsten says, thanks so much for the exciting and important conversation. Question: if we wanted to exert pressure on US policy towards refugees, where could we start? And where is morality in terms of government policy?
Such a great question, Kirsten. Where do we exert pressure in terms of policy? I think one area is just around the immigration debate. So immigration is discussed very broadly, of course, and I get very hopeful when I think of the way people responded to many of Trump's horrific policies, responded negatively to oppose them. And that could be in part because they were also opposing a particular worldview at the same time. But what if we continue to do that, and we continue to let the current administration know that it's not just a matter of not harming refugees, but we actually care about living in a world where refugees make a difference. So I think that's one area, and that's always in the news. It's always being discussed and debated. So to try to encourage a perspective that takes seriously our position as a nation and the importance of what we owe to each other, but not at the exclusion of thinking about how our policies impact people more broadly. And I think that's where morality comes into play. It's not that we have to be selfless and not think about the good of our country or national priorities or anything like that, not at all. But I think there's a way in which we can connect that to these moral imperatives. And I hope people who are more skilled politicians can do that. I think if I've been thinking about the Biden administration's climate policy, the way they built into it a response to the only rejoinder left against climate change policy, which is jobs. They're going to lose jobs in these poor parts of the country, and this is a terrible thing to do. And he's anticipated that and said, no, that we're doing the right thing by fighting climate change, and we're going to do it in a way that helps all people. I feel like that's the same message we could have for refugees. It's not like we're helping refugees and not helping Americans. We're helping by helping refugees, by having an ethical refugee policy and encouraging other countries to work with us on this. We can actually live in a world that is ultimately beneficial for us as it is for other people.
So we have one final question. I think we can both address. Kirsten again says, this might speak more to David's book about common humanity. How do you think the whole emphasis on individuals and meritocracy affects the judgment on those who are marginalized, poor, minoritized, both here in the US and elsewhere? How do philosophers think about that? Well, I don't think we can generalize about how philosophers think about it, but we can say how we think about it. I don't know.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that I'd like to answer that in response to what Serena has said so much about obligation. The burden obligation is a heavy one, and it's very tempting, particularly when race is involved, to naturalize degradation, to think that these people, whomever they are, who are not like us, are in their circumstances because of their inferiority, their incompetence, their lack of intelligence, their lack of morality, whatever. I mean, in the history of philosophy, you can go back to David Hume, who talked about how our sympathies are unevenly distributed. So that way of thinking, which gets really ideologically embedded, is a way of freeing ourselves from really coming to grips with the suffering in the world and our obligation to do something about that. So I think these ideas, yeah, I think they're pretty pervasive, and I think they're really important in exerting a negative impact on our ability to address these things properly.
Yeah, I agree.
Serena, I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Likewise, David. Thank you so much.
And I would like everyone to go out and buy the book.
I'm
And
gonna
not go out and buy the book, order it
you
from
don't have
Belmont
to
Books.
leave
You don't have to
your
go out.
home.
From the comfort of your home, you can order this book, and I can guarantee you that it will be worthwhile.
I'm gonna put the link in the chat one more time in case you missed it, so where you can buy both David and Serena's books and whatever other books you may want. If you're local, we also do contactless curbside pickup. So if you're local and you don't want to pay for shipping, that is an option. Thank you all for coming tonight. This was a wonderful discussion. We had some wonderful questions, and thank you to Serena and David both. If any of you came in late, usually within 48 hours, we have a recording of this event up on our Belmont Books YouTube channel, so you can kind of catch up with what you missed. But thank you all, and thank you to Serena and David for doing this tonight.
Thank you, Belmont Books, for having me.
Indeed.
And thank you to David for your great questions.
And thank you all for tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming.